So it's good to be here. I see the clock on the wall. We're noted to be punctual, and that's one of the reasons why the crowds come. And I will have a couple thoughts about the event tonight in my talk, so listen closely. But my assignment today is to speak on Julia Greeley. And often when I have been saying that I'm giving this talk, people say, "Who's Julia Greeley?" And if you're not from Denver, you're likely not to know. If you are from Denver, you've probably heard about her. Julia Greeley of Denver was and is a servant of God, which is the title that people give to people whose causes have been opened up by the church, specifically by the Archdiocese of Denver, where Julia Greeley lived, died, and was buried. And if you're buried in a certain place, that's often the place where the cause arises from within that diocese. And on August 6, 2016, Archbishop Samuel Aquila asked the Congregation of the Cause of Saints to open this cause of this woman. And in October, a couple months later, the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints published its decree declaring nihil obstat, nothing stands in the way of opening Julia Greeley's cause, which entitled her to be called Servant of God. The next month, in 2016, November, the full body of the Catholic bishops of the United States who meet in in Washington, D.C. every November, gave their approbation, their approval to this cause. And in May 2017, Julia Greeley's remains were exhumed. Now, here comes the tricky part, because I'm not really a PowerPoint person, but I have been urged to do so because this is a best practice these days. Even though John Cavadini refuses, under the phrase, power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I have been dragged into the younger generation's preferences, and there's Julia Greeley's, where she was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. And they exhumed her remains. The Catholic Church is very material. It cares a lot about bodies. So they exhumed her remains, and they determined two things that came out of this, more probably, but two things. She was 5'1", and she suffered from arthritis, crippling arthritis. They could tell. But they removed her remains and transferred them to Immaculate Conception Cathedral in downtown Denver in June of 2017. And they placed her bones in a funerary chest, which a year later was itself placed within a sarcophagus. And in August of 2018, the archdiocesan phase of the cause was completed, and 11,750 pages of documentation were sealed and sent to Rome. And in January of 2021, the congregation certified that the archdiocesan phase of the process had been done correctly, thereby paving the way for the Roman phase of it. This is a Holy Mother bureaucracy at her best. After which a person was hired to draft the official positio for the cause. And in February of 2022, a relator was appointed. All this is explained in a book that I recommend called Making Saints by Ken Woodward. It's an interesting book. But none of this answers the question, who was Julia Greeley? So let's return to that. I have three things to say under the theme of black woman, a white angel, and a red wagon. A black woman. Notably, about Julia Greeley, she was a slave. And because she was a slave, we don't know much about her early life. For example, we don't know when she was born. Researchers have located her birth somewhere between the years 1832 and 1848. So we don't even know the decade in which she was born. And she later said, "No one ever told me when I was born." Because why would you want to know when she was born? Maybe, perhaps, you'd want to know because if she was a woman, if she was of childbearing years, she would be more valuable in a slave sale. Because one thing slaves provided were more slaves. She hardly knew her mother. Though when she was little, she did intervene when her mother was getting a whipping by her slave owner, and she herself was whipped in her left eye and was blinded for life, and a watery substance oozed out of her eye for the rest of her life, and she carried a handkerchief around all the time to do this. And that's represented in that slide there. The details of Julia's early life are general and lost in the mists of history, but we do have evidence that she worked on a relatively large plantation outside of Hannibal, Missouri, which was a city on the banks, still is a city on the banks of the Mississippi River. And in 1850, nearly a quarter of Hannibal's populations were black slaves. Located on the Mississippi River, it was a hub for the slave trade, and slave auctions were a common sight. And Hannibal's most famous citizen, Mark Twain, recalls in his autobiography a powerful memory from his childhood in which he saw a group of enslaved men and women chained together, waiting to be sent to a slave market downriver. And Twain described the moment as looking at the saddest faces I ever saw. Missouri was not officially a Confederate state. So even though there were slaves there, they were not freed in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. That pertained to Confederate states. Rather, they had to wait until 1865. And when it was finally abolished, we can infer that Julia, naturally, was very happy about this because she took the name, the evidence indicates, Greeley, after the famous editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, who supported President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But even after emancipation, slaves in Missouri continued to live in servitude under the weight of the segregation of Jim Crow laws and financial hardship, violence, and so on. Julia, it seems, was able to acquire servanthood in the household of the Dickerson family, in which there was a daughter, also named Julia Dickerson, who eventually in her life married William Gilpin, who had served as the territorial governor of Colorado in 1861 and 1862. There's a downtown street in Denver named Gilpin Street after him. And William Gilpin brought his new wife, Julia, to Denver sometime, we think, in the early 1870s. And Julia worked for the Dickerson family back in Missouri, but then came to Denver to be hired by Julia Gilpin and to take care of that household. And we have here on record the eldest, Julia Gilpin brought, this is what the historical record says, along with her eldest daughter, an ex-slave known as One-Eyed Julia Greeley. But as it turns out, that they ended up settling in a house in Champa Street in downtown Denver, and Julia worked in that household starting around 1880. At the same time, Sacred Heart Parish was started nearby and dedicated in 1880, the same year that Julia herself, under the influence of Julia Dickerson or Julia Gilpin, became Catholic and entered the church and was conditionally baptized. And for the next 38 years, she lived mainly in Denver, though she did take jobs in Colorado Springs, in New Mexico, in Wyoming. And if you live out west, these are 10 hours away, but that's considered next door when you live out west. And Julia was something of a vagabond, both in those cities and then in Denver. She walked the streets of Denver. She ran afoul of the head of the household, William Gilpin. She had to get other jobs. She lived in boarding houses. She was a cleaner at a brothel, a house of ill fame, as they called it back then. She was lived on the seedy side of Denver city life, the underside. And at one point, she visited the Gilpin family. She remained close with Julia Gilpin for all those years. And she was given a donkey shed to stay the night in out back. But Julia Greeley, this black woman known as Black Julia, was also known as an angel of charity. And this came to be associated with the white angel. So I want to dwell on this theme for just a second. The story about Julia and the white angel emerged 20 years after Julia Greeley died. She died in 1918 on June 7th, on the Feast of the Sacred Heart. And 20 years later, after her death, a story emerged in a radio show called the Sacred Heart Radio Show, which told of Julia's life and her popularity at the time of her death. And this was most visibly demonstrated when, at her funeral, hundreds of people came out to pass by her coffin and to pay her respects. Because she was poor, but she was a regular member of Sacred Heart Parish, they laid her out in the church, the first time that's ever happened with a lay person in the history of Colorado. And at the time, it was seen that people regarded her as a saint. This newspaper article that came out in 1939 in response to the radio show reports this: there was nothing beautiful about Julia Greeley except her soul and her smile. She had one eye, her face was wrinkled and probably ugly, but her smile showed forth the charity of Christ, and her soul was white as white. It's interesting. And in response to the diocesan newspaper article, see how these stories create stories? A woman by the name of Agnes Urquhart wrote in with her own story about Julia, the story of her birth. And the story is associated with this photo of Julia Greeley, the only known photo we have. And the story goes like this. Mrs. Urquhart, Agnes Urquhart, who desired to employ a maid, was sitting on her front porch one day more than 20 years ago. This is written in 1939. When she saw an old negress walking slowly down the street. She called to her, asking if she would come in and wash the floors. The woman accepted her offer and entered the house. She immediately noticed the holy pictures in the rooms and remarked, "You must be Catholic." Julia told Mrs. Urquhart how she distributed leaflets of the League of the Sacred Heart throughout the city and how she worked in Sacred Heart Church. She remarked on the absences of children in the home. The Urquharts' only child was a boy who had died 13 years previously, and said before long they would have a girl. Her prediction was true. After Marjorie's birth, she came regularly to the Urquhart residence. A daily communicant, Julie never ate until she came to take care of Marjorie at about 11 o'clock every morning. She stayed until 7 o'clock in the evening, all day long as she went about her work. Julia prayed and sang songs to the Sacred Heart. What a curious, somewhat disconcerting story. The way Mrs. Urquhart calls out to Julia, as if it's right out of the Old South, like on To Kill a Mockingbird. Hey, girl, you come wash my floors, I'll give you $1. That type of thing. The word negress, from another era with different sensibilities. The story, we could say the text, like scholars say these days, the text is susceptible to race and class analysis. Fair enough, it is, unmistakably. But I want to suggest we can go further. Julia, the former slave, the poor black woman, steps into the house, starts to work, and sees holy pictures on the wall, maybe a statue here or there, and blurts out, "You must be Catholic." And in doing so, opens up a different set of meanings for that encounter. Like she was tapping into an alternative universe, a secret Catholic code. And then she goes even further, remarking on the absence of children. Says, "Where's your kids?" And then further still, "Before long, you'll have a girl." And so it came to pass. Again, there's the girl. She had no rational grounds for saying this. Moreover, it seems rude and invasive on this private grief of this poor mother and household. I mean, who does this woman think she is? Who does she think she is interrupting my sorrow and my broken heart? Who is she to challenge this unspeakable grief? And Julia seems to have had this uninhibited confidence, this irrepressible joy, singing all day long while she's working, this self-assurance that was rooted beyond herself. And this, I think Julia would say, I think we can say, is from her devotion to the Sacred Heart. We know, because of the records that came out, the stories that came out afterwards, after she died, she used to distribute leaflets from house to house. Leaflets put out by the League of the Sacred Heart. Prayer leaflets that came out monthly, each one focused on how to cultivate a key aspect of the devotion of the Sacred Heart and pinpointing a specific need of the church as an intention of prayer, all centered on the Sacred Heart. And these are the prayer leaflets, one every month. And it all makes sense in the fact that Julia was a member of the Sacred Heart Church in Denver, which was operated by the Jesuits, who had a special devotion in these centuries to the Sacred Heart. And one of the first things that the Jesuit priests of the Sacred Heart said of Julia is that she was a zealous apostle of the Sacred Heart, and that they had ever known, the most zealous. And the language here is important. Apostle, someone who is sent out. It's part of her apostolate to propagate the Sacred Heart. This kind of language has been lost, but I want to restore the word apostolate. And this idea of being part of what was called an apostleship of prayer, which was famous and rooted in the 19th and 20th century spirituality, especially by the Jesuits and their co-workers. It was begun in France in 1844 by a Jesuit by the name of Father Fantrus Gautrelet, who urged seminarians, be apostles of prayer. Offer everything you are doing every day in union with the heart of our Lord, for what he wishes, the spread of the kingdom and the salvation of souls. And this apostleship of the Sacred Heart was part of the League of the Sacred Heart, where people would consecrate their daily work to the Sacred Heart and join in prayers for specific monthly intentions. There was a magazine called The Messenger of the Sacred Heart, first published in 1861 and replicated in more than 50 different publications around the world, all devoted to the Sacred Heart. The Sacred Heart was in the 19th century. And it should be noted that it was promoted at the highest echelons of the church, including Pope Leo XIII, who on May 25th, 1899, promulgated an encyclical dedicating the whole human race to the Sacred Heart. He kind of had a broad vision, papal vision. And it was, the encyclical is named Annum Sacrum, which describes the Sacred Heart as a symbol and sensible image of the infinite love of Jesus, which moves us to love one another. Outward, all peoples, all nations, everywhere. And Julia was devoted to this. This is a part of a painting that was on the walls in the parish where she used to worship. And as part of the League of the Sacred Heart in that parish, they had a monthly communion of reparation every first Friday, which was also called for by Leo XIII. So this entire episode, Julia walking by, Mrs. Urquhart calling out to her, their friendly, faith-filled conversation, Julia's unusual prediction, her prophecy, we might say, it all happened, we could say, out of the energy of the Sacred Heart. Well, this is not the only episode to have happened along these lines. Julia was known to go all over the streets of Denver, spreading the message of the Sacred Heart. And she had a particular care to bring this message to firehouses. There were 30 firehouses in Denver, and every month she brought the new prayer cards to the firehouses because one time early on when she was in Denver, 5 firemen lost their lives fighting fires, and it was in 5 Points, the black section of Denver, and all the firemen were black who died. And she took that grief and turned it into a message. We can see this dynamic in the gospel, can't we? So she disseminates this message, and now we have this woman, the child in the picture, telling the story to the newspaper in 1939, 20 years after Julia's died. So she became known, they called the baby in the picture the little white angel, but she became known as the angel of charity. So that's the third thing I want to say, the red wagon theme. What I want to say is that her devotion to the Sacred Heart was directed outwardly. The devotion to the Sacred Heart, if you can even see it on the images, it's not like navel gazing. It's usually like this or like this. Like right before the administration building, there's a statue of the Sacred Heart. The CFC has had this devotion very, very deeply. And it's open to almost like to envelop the whole world. It's not locked into an interior space. Rather, the Sacred Heart opens arms outstretched outwardly, and Julia enacted this on the streets of Denver. And in addition to working for various households, mopping, cleaning, cooking, tending to children, she also brought items of people that people needed. And she used to carry them around, there's one story, in a red wagon. What would she bring to people? Clothes, food, toys for kids. And so that the guild for Julia Greeley has a newsletter called The Little Red Wagon. That's their first issue, 2014, and that's an issue from last spring. There's Julia, there's The Little Red Wagon. And she used to bring people things at night. And the story goes that she brought these to people at night because she was bringing items of charity to be given to people, and the people were white and would be ashamed to be receiving charity from a black woman. And so she brought things under cover of night. Think about it. This old, unsightly, one-eyed black woman, a former slave, suffering from lifelong blindness inflicted from the whip of a harsh slave owner, and now living in a deeply segregated state in a white society. And she's the charitable giver. The most poignant, perplexing sign of this white society comes out in her stories when people would say to her, because of her holiness, "Oh, Julia, you're black, but your soul is pure and white." Or would say to her, "Oh, I know, when you get to heaven, you'll be white too." In other words, you'll be like us, one of us. Remarks that maybe were well-intentioned, but nevertheless steeped in this tendency we have to rank people as higher and lower, as closer to God or further away, as first and last. Even at Notre Dame, we have revealed a slight tendency to be concerned with rankings. How are we ranked this week? What are we this week? 13. See, everyone knows the ranking. And Southern Cal's ranked. It's going to be a good game tonight. Elsewhere in academia, we're concerned about the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Pay attention not to the rankings. But when it comes to God, we don't know where anyone stands, including ourselves. That's why the Buddhists say, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill it. Because when you think you've made it, you have not made it. The first will be last, and the last will be first. The phrase that Jesus uses after some of his parables, and the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. If you think about that parable, with the Pharisee up front saying, "Oh, I'm so glad I'm with you, God, not like this poor schmuck in the last row." And the publican is down there saying, "Have mercy on me." And Jesus says, the first will be last and the last will be first. And, you just have to think for a minute to realize that there's no way out of that parable. Because if you're the Pharisee, you're in trouble. And if you're the publican in the back row, you're in good shape. But that means you're first, and then you're back in trouble. So then there's no way to get out of that parable. You just have to forget it, the rankings altogether, and cast yourself upon the mercy of God. And so it's very odd and disturbing and contradictory to the gospel for someone to say, "Oh, I know you'll be white in heaven." How does she know? That she won't, how does the white woman who said that to her know that she won't be black in heaven? I mean, Felicity and Perpetua were black saints. A lot of saints were people of color, some of our favorites, Augustine, so on. And Augustus Tolton, Theo Bowman, so many saints in waiting now are black. What I want to suggest, what I want to play with here is this idea that Julia is a subversive figure in the church, precisely because she overturns our sensibilities of race, of wealth, of success, of effectiveness, even of justice. For she had a claim to justice, being enslaved and enduring segregation. Even in her own church, there's a story where they tried to get her out of the first pew, because she always took the first pew. But the pastor wouldn't let the crowd to try to kick her out of the church. And she offered to go to another church, and the pastor said, no, you stay here, this is your church. But how does she respond to this injustice? With her little red wagon. She was a she became a third order Franciscan. She was very promiscuous when it came to aligning herself with religious orders. And she died with a little third order Franciscan habit on. But she spent her life performing the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting the sick and the imprisoned, and the spiritual works of mercy, which in many ways are a lot harder. I've discovered in my present state of life. I'm married. Instruct the ignorant, counsel the doubtful, admonish the sinner, bearing wrongs patiently, forgiving offenses willingly, our whole lives. So these practices stretch our conceptions of justice. Charity always includes justice, but goes beyond justice. And this is played out in the life of Julia Greeley, who makes of herself an angel of charity, and so overturns the injustice that she suffered through a kind of reparation, not for her sins, although I'm sure she was mindful of that, but for the sins of everybody, the sins of others, so that she neutralizes the injustice and turns the whole episode toward Christ, toward the Sacred Heart. And this is where she ended up, in the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception on Colfax Avenue in Denver, Colorado. So let me conclude by giving what they call these days takeaways from, everyone's got to have takeaways these days, yeah? About Julia. One, the obvious thing that I've been hinting at has to do with racism and reconciliation and reparation. And there's a lot of controversy in our society about this, DEI, reparation, and so on. And there's sides that people take. I think Julia represents a different perspective on this from a different level. Not a political approach, not a polarizing approach, a theological and ecclesial approach in which reparation is rooted in the work of Christ, the new Adam, who heals humanity through the atonement on the cross, paying off the debt of sin and disobedience of the old Adam, and inviting and enabling us to participate in the work of co-atonement by making reparation for our collective guilt. A lot of people say, why should I have to make reparation for slavery? It wasn't me. Well, we Catholics believe in collective guilt. and this, we are to make of our whole lives a work of reparation. We do it every day. If you look carefully, you find yourself doing it or desiring it. Another thing, we can do the work of mercy that Julia Greeley did ourselves. We live in a bureaucratic age, and we think the only way to get things done is through large-scale institutions, starting charitable agencies and organizations, nonprofits. You can even get a degree for nonprofit management here at Notre Dame. And Julia Greeley, who had no degrees, who, by the way, couldn't read or write. It was illegal for slaves to learn to read or write. It was illegal to teach them. She's the ultimate anti-bureaucratic saint in waiting, along with other servants of God like Dorothy Day, Peter Moore, the Catholic worker, people I love to align myself with. The power of suffering love and the works of mercy. There's no greater power in the world. This comes from a line in the Brothers Karamazov by Father Zosima. There's no greater power in the world. Therese de Lisieux believed the same things. In Julia Greeley's day, there was a lot going on in history. If we located her life in history, the Civil War, the Emancipation, westward expansion, the Indian Wars on the Western Plains. The Battle of Little Bighorn was 2 or 3 years before Julia came to Denver. And not far from Denver. The Colorado becomes a state in 1877, the Colorado Gold Rush, the mining wars of Colorado, the Ludlow Massacre, the end of her life, the first years, throughout really almost the entirety of the Great War, World War I. But history works mysteriously so that those great events in history perhaps are not the center of history. Perhaps the center of history comes with the practice of works of mercy on the streets of Denver. Maybe that's what was really going on. Peter Morin says we should tell our history by the history of the saints. So here's a way to put it, there's an undercurrent of charity in history that is small and harder to discern. And the great powers of the world do not perceive it. Paul says this in the Corinthians. But it is discernible by the followers of Christ, our true King. And this is the purpose of the title of this book by Father Blaine Berkey, who I have to cite and commend because really it's his work that has given us so much of what we know about Julia Greeley. It's called In Secret Service of the Sacred Heart. That's what was going on in the 1880s in Denver and 90s and the 19s up till her death and beyond. But beyond, because the story is still being told. And that's my third point. Blaine Berkey has gathered up all that he could of the fragments of the story of Julia Greeley and has retold it in ways that people like me can try to make sense of it. And this is really an ancient practice. In the martyrdom of Polycarp, it says at one point in the account that we have, we are gathering up this story so that you may be gathered in to the story. It's the feast of St. Luke the Apostle, the evangelist, today. And you know what we have to learn about the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles? The book is not closed. The book is open and being lived still, so that we tell those stories, we tell Julia's stories, so that we ourselves can be brought into that kingdom where blackness is a virtue and one eye is as good as two. And we are gathered up so that we ourselves may someday be servants of God. And who knows, we're all called to be saints in waiting. Thank you.
Friends,
Do you have copies of those?
Do I have a copy of this? How much do you want for it? No. It's free in the giving. I think we're supposed to do
We do have time for questions.
a few questions.
I actually have one, if it's okay. And then I'll briefly, probably we can't find any way of knowing this, but did Julia Greeley have any access to Sister Mary, Margaret Mary Alacoque's and her call for reparations against, so that was a big theme.
Big theme.
Of Margaret Mary, whose feast day we just recently celebrated.
Yes, it's in the second reading in the Office of Readings I noticed the other day, October 16th. I don't know is the answer to that. And if she did have access to it, it was probably through it being passed on to her verbally, because she wouldn't have read the Office of Readings or whatever. And but I can't imagine that with all this literature being produced and disseminated at the time, that she didn't somehow learn of it through readings. But, there was 11,000 documents, 11,000 plus documents sent to Rome, and you wonder, she couldn't read or write. What are all these documents? It's always ready to complexify. Yes, we have a question here, one and then two.
Thank you. What more do we know about the little white angel?
She, in 1939, she told that story in the newspaper, and in this book, she has family, and the story got passed down through her family, and so on. She remained in Denver, but beyond that, I'm not sure. But that's this saint is so interesting. Julia Greeley is so interesting because it's all like, I don't want to say gossip. It's all like, hey, I heard a story too. And so like it's very local. People in Denver kind of know the buildings and so on. And in fact, Father Berkey takes people around every March in a bus tour, a Julia Greeley bus tour. It's very cool. Yeah.
I noticed on the one of your exceptional PowerPoint slides that
hey, this is my inaugural presentation.
That the little red wagon edition was called the St. Catherine Drexel edition on that slide. Do you know if she ever had the ability? Of course, St. Catherine Drexel. If she ever had an exchange with the saint, for one. Or two, obviously, Catherine Drexel's mission was to the African American and Native American communities, and I'm kind of curious if there's any history there.
Do you know? Nancy read a book by her about her. I don't know either. You guys are all stumping me here.
I got a question back there, but are you going to answer this?
That's a great question. Yeah. Now here's another connection. There's another guy being brought up to be a saint in Denver. Not officially, but there's a movement. His name is Ben Salmon. He was a conscientious objector in World War I, 2.5 years in prison for refusing to fight. And he stayed at Fort Logan as prisoner, right near my house, actually. And Julia worked there in 1918. And I wonder, did she ever bring him beans or something like that? I don't know. Yes, sir.
I'm from Detroit, and Blessed Solanus Casey is, as I understand it, one documented miracle away from being canonized. Can you, short of reading the book Making Saints, can you give a quick synopsis of the process, the steps, and how many, not detail, but how many people are in a holding pattern, waiting for whatever the next miracle is or the next thing to happen?
I don't know. And Ken's book. Ken's a wonderful guy, Notre Dame grad. He was religion editor at Newsweek for 20, 30 years. I don't know how many are in waiting. What do I know? I know that people who are, because I'm teaching a course on the saints in the spring, I'm reading his book now. And people need, if they're martyred, one miracle, and if they're not martyred, need two. After the Roman phase of the canonization process has been completed. Do you know any more about that?
You need one to be beatified and two to be canonized.
And 2 to be canonized. Okay. My guess is that there are, and again, I don't know the details of this. Where's Larry Cunningham when you need him? My guess is that there are a lot, because a lot more people's causes have been introduced since the pontificate of John Paul II, basically. It's one of Ken Woodward's points, is that it becomes streamlined. And, but to answer your question, no, I don't know exactly the process at that point. Yeah, you know, don't you?
Just one little thing is that it being declared venerable, right?
Yes.
That means that the level of heroic virtue has been certified.
Yes.
So that's like another whole classification,
And then beatification upon the occasion of a miracle, and then canonization. Yes.
Yeah, so actually, I have two questions. If you have time, you can both, you not choose one. So you didn't say much about her conversion experience, how she went from being a slave, former slave, was just probably never exposed to Catholicism, ultimately becoming not just a Catholic, but a pretty devout one. And then the other comment you made was we as Catholics all believe in collective guilt, and could you expound on that a little bit? What the theological underpinnings of that are? Not that I'm disputing it. It was a curious statement to really.
No, that's a helpful
something
question.
I missed. Yeah.
Yeah, your first question. What was your first question again?
I forget. It was about her conversion experience. How did she
go from? She got it from Julia Gilpin.
She got it from her, but there's no.
As being part of the household.
So we just don't know what that.
Don't know, but I think that she was urged to go to church, and she became deeply devoted. And she said at one point, because she was, she said, don't you feel like some resentment or something toward the Gilpins because they had a messy divorce at one point, and she got dragged into the court proceedings. In fact, we know a lot about Julia because of her testimony in a court proceeding. But what Julia said is, I'm not resentful at all because Mrs. Gilpin gave me my faith, and that's the greatest gift of all. So you get the impression that it was imparted one by one. Collective guilt is an unpopular topic, especially in our individualistic culture where what did I do to? And the question for us is that we have no individuality separate from our humanity and separate from Christ, and that all of our sins are in one sense collective and communal. And in that sense, we readily and willingly take on in our lives works to repair humanity from the sins of others. Again, in the Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima says, be responsible for everybody's sins. Take responsibility for everyone's sins, not so as to paralyze us in guilt, but so that we can learn to pour our lives out. So that my own view is that it's taken, I guess I want to say in somewhat of a healthy way, we would make our whole lives lives of reparation, and I feel like we do that.
So it's a spiritual reparation as opposed to, when we think of reparation, we usually think of money.
Yes, that's right. And I'm not averse to that, but that's a secular question. Now, note this: it's brought up in the Catechism that restitution for sins should be a part of penance. It's right in the Catholic Catechism. And the notion of reparation appears like 12 times in the Catechism. So it really is a central facet of our faith and of our spirituality. But spiritual reparations, we tend to think are easy, but I don't think they are. Because how do you really, really learn to be on the receiving end of things that Julia was on the receiving end of? And I think that's a process that through practices of mercy and prayer, we can begin to get a sense of that. But that moves us, I would say, toward Christ. Yes, he's the ultimate reparation, yeah.
Friends, we got time for one brief question.
Awesome presentation, a lot of tough questions. I feel like you need a W right now. So here you go.
I'll take an incomplete.
Who is Notre Dame going to beat tonight?
So, I have a bunch of throwaway lines that I didn't put in here, but here's what I want to say. I lived on campus here for many years, and of course, I was just saying to John yesterday, I love football weekends. It's just so exciting. And everyone's so excited. And, when you live here for a while, you get a little tired of it. It's like, oh, another one, But I want to say that it's really exciting to be here on a football weekend. And I hope that Notre Dame wins because I have a brother-in-law who went to Southern Cal. And he'd been harassing me since Notre Dame lost the first two. So I bought all the nieces and nephews the shirt this year. And he texted me a couple months ago, or a couple weeks ago, and says, "Hey, Michael, why don't you send that every year? Maybe Notre Dame will keep losing or something." And so I want them to kill. But I must say this. I would have every football weekend that I'm here, at the end of the day or the next day, I would say, especially if they lost, it doesn't really matter. And I feel like that is kind of a lesson there, is that this is great, but there's heaven too.